Give Sam a.
Thanks, everybody. I'm Sam. I'm so glad to be here. I'm so glad to be in a room full of people and online that care about the land trust on the land that we call home. With my time, I'm going to share what I hope is a overflowing of enthusiasm for these incredible organisms that we share the landscape with, and put some ideas in your head that what you've been seeing your whole life out here may be a little more complex than you first realized, and invite you to the next time you're out on the land trust trail, stop and slow down and smell the flowers, so to speak. With that, I would just invite everybody to be comfortable. It's the lunch hour. We have food. The last thing I want you to do is be hungry and thinking about getting that food. So I'm sorry for the folks online. Please feel free to ask a question or get up, use the restroom, grab an extra snack. This series, the Lunch and Learn series, is supposed to sort of share a bit of what we do at the Land Trust and a lot of different topics. This is just one of them. There's a lot of the stuff I'll talk about today we could take in a bunch of different directions. And so it's a little bit of an invitation too to dive in yourself. You know, these Lunch and Learn topics. I mean, last month is the tough act to follow. I don't know if folks were over at the college for that one, but it's really cool to see different folks' interest and enthusiasm really shine with different topics. I learned a ton at last month's, and with my presentation today, we'll poke a little bit into what I've been thinking about for a little while now. The big sagebrush. You ever hug one? They are a little stiff and prickly, so they're kind of hard to hug, but you can maybe imagine if in your mind's eye what that smell is like. You know, their flowers are not very showy, just to show some of my cards, but man, that smell of some fresh sagebrush leaves certainly is remarkable. And
I have some in bloom from my yard. Should I pass around?
sure, yeah, give it a smell.
Picked it just before I came over.
And I thought, you know, the real botanical folks among us might say, like, Sam, a little bit of false advertising. It's really more of a summer flower and a fall fruit. So fall fruits or fall flowers. What I thought I would sort of center this presentation on is sagebrush through the year. And so after this little intro, we're going to kind of like follow this organism through the seasons and explore how it's so successful here and so successful across its range, and a bit of the life history, how it interacts with other plants and animals, and just sort of unpack what is a bit of a mystery still as to how this plant has been so successful. So there we are. We're looking out from mostly the Horse Lake area across the Wenatchee foothills. Wenatchee Valley can kind of seem like almost the entire universe sometimes, right? But this range of big sagebrush goes a little bit further. It's not just our plant. It grows lots and lots of different places. What we're looking at is a range map, which is basically like, let's paint a map on everywhere this plant grows. The top there is their fancy Latin name, Artemisia tridentata. And what you're looking at is from nearly Mexico to Canada today, big sagebrush still grows. And for the Lockwoods in Wyoming, you'll notice that pretty much all of Wyoming is big sagebrush, or at least a good third of the state. And up here in the Cascades, where we are, the eastern flanks of the Cascades, we're really almost at the northern extent of its range. And we are especially on the western boundary of that range, right? We're really right on the margin of this cool little plant. We're going to talk about a lot of why sagebrush can grow here, but I guess just kind of take it into your own mental geography. The second you start driving up towards Leavenworth, you start to leave big sagebrush behind, right? So it's really a dramatic transition zone that we're in, and kind of a testament to how tough and scrappy those sagebrush are. So maybe one of the first factoids you can take home with you from this talk is that sagebrush is in the sunflower family, which incidentally is the biggest plant family in the world. If you didn't know it, a lot of people think orchids, they're so diverse and everything. There are more sunflowers than any other group of plants. Let's look at its range map. It's everywhere. So if you're looking for Asteraceae or the asters, this is where they grow pretty much everywhere but under the Greenland ice sheet and Antarctica. So incredibly diverse and successful set of plants.
It probably will be growing there in those places in about 30, 40 years.
It could be, and we're just about to talk about ice sheets. It's and I guess like a little note for the more botanical minded folks is some asters are some of the only ones that bloom in the fall. There's really not that many plants that bloom in the fall. Rabbit brush, if you've seen that one around here, know that plant, that's another fall bloomer, also in the sunflower family. So it's really kind of a unique little niche that it's found itself in. So I want to go way back in time to when glaciers were covering our area, right? And kind of talk about why sagebrush is distributed across the West, why it's in Wenatchee. And it just kind of reminds you of like what a glacier does to the landscape. It is like the world's biggest eraser, right? Just resetting the clock, scraping every living thing away and resetting it to mineral, rock, and soil. So you can see like under the toe of that ice sheet there, a half a mile thick of ice pushing across the landscape. I mean, that's why we carve mountain valleys, and that's why part of Iowa's soil is so rich and productive, is like the world's biggest shovel kind of like scooping up all this matter and depositing it somewhere else. And the glaciers came and went in cycles, right? Interglacial periods. You've probably heard some of that. And at every time the world's biggest eraser came and went, it's kind of reset the clock. And if you are kind of the animal oriented person, like stuff was crazy going on back then. I mean, the Pleistocene was kind of a wild time, and it took a certain set of adaptations to be able to be successful. So every time the glaciers went and came back and went and came back, that was free real estate, and the sagebrush were able to respond to that. And so one of the first reasons why sagebrush blooms in the fall is that their little seeds are able to skitter across the surface of the snow and disperse through both wind and this kind of crusty snow layer. So like super helpful in the interglacial, but still helpful today. In an average Wenatchee winter, you get enough snow on the ground, and these little seeds, which we'll come back to later in the talk, are really well adapted to just tumble on the surface of the snow. So sagebrush bloom in the fall so that their seeds can disperse on the snow. If you didn't know what a sagebrush seed looks like, that is a US penny right there. That's as small as they are. So kind of keep that in mind as we go on. So just a little commentary on this plant. We're going to see this slide a couple of times as I talk about different parts of the sagebrush. But kind of a fascinating thing about sagebrush in evolutionary history is like sunflower family, right? You think sunflowers, showy, beautiful, oh, you know, pollinators, all this stuff. Sagebrush, in its evolutionary arc, its ancestors were insect pollinated, and they said enough of this shenanigans, we're going back to being wind pollinated, which is one of the first pollination syndromes we ever had evolve on the planet. So conifers, right? They're all wind pollinated. Lots of grasses are wind pollinated. Sagebrush also is wind pollinated. And that's kind of a unique thing evolutionarily when you can kind of lose a trait and regress back. But sagebrush was like out there in the ice age, trying to make its life. And it's like, we're done with insects. We're going to go back to being wind pollinated. So if you are somebody that is unfortunate enough to be allergic to sagebrush, this might be the culprit, is the little pollen granules. And every year, this time of year when the flowers really mature and set to go to seed, that's what's going on, is these tiny little microscopic seeds, pollen grains are flying around and finding one, the next sagebrush plant over. So for the Lockwoods, these photos are from Wyoming, actually. But if you've ever been out in the sagebrush steppe, you know how charming it is. And I guess this is an invitation. If you haven't interacted with sagebrush outside of the Wenatchee area, go out into the steppe, because it kind of reminds you of the Ice Age and the Pleistocene, just the open vastness of it, where sagebrush is super successful, is a good reminder of why wind pollination really works. Okay, let's advance through the year, because we know that winter is coming. I found this in the CDLT photo library and was just so impressed by it. That's from basically the Horse Lake area looking north to Castle Rock. I know some folks aren't ready for winter yet. I kind of am. And the ability for this plant to survive our winters is really quite remarkable. But let's kind of talk about why sagebrush is an important part of habitat winter first, before we kind of talk about how it survives it. So every year in December, we close all the trails north of Fifth Street, right? We close the Sage Hills Gateway, we close Fifth Street, we close Horse Lake. Why? For these critters right there. That's wintering mule deer. And in a really remarkable set of biological synchrony, the mule deer know when to migrate and where to go. And it's a hard dang time. I mean, I don't know if anybody's tried to survive outside in the wintertime lately, but it's rough. And what these mule deer find themselves with is a steady decline in their body condition until they could just get by enough to survive to the next spring, right? Loss of wildlife in the winter happens every year. And sagebrush is one of their it's like a ace in the hole. It's their trick to surviving the winter. When the winter snows come, sometimes the only thing poking out of the whole landscape are just a few little sprigs of sagebrush. We're going to talk a lot about leaves in the sagebrush later, but just to kind of cut to the chase here, there's this incredible cycle of secondary metabolites or these volatile compounds in the sagebrush leaves. Why Kurt's leaves that he passed around in flowers are so smelly is because of these kind of metabolically expensive chemicals that the plant says, this is what I want to make. This is what I want to do with my free time. They are not cheap. It takes a lot of energy to make them, but it's the same class of things as aspirin and caffeine and so many pharmaceuticals. Those secondary metabolites, as we call them in sciences, are have unlocked so much stuff that we enjoy day to day. And these critters are ruminants. What does that mean? That means that they have a very high fiber diet. They're eating plants, lots of it woody, and their intestinal tract is supercharged because they have a whole community of microorganisms that help break down those woody plant material into digestible carbohydrates. So if you try to eat the same thing a mule deer does, you would die because you can't get enough nutrients out of those woody plants. When a mule deer eats a sagebrush sprig in the springtime, the secondary metabolites are such that it's antimicrobial. And it'll actually disrupt that wonderful gut flora plant community that they have. Essentially, if they eat too much sagebrush in the springtime, it'll make them sick. Sure, we get that. But the amazing synchrony that I was mentioning is that in the wintertime, when these things are poking up above the snow, the sagebrush has tuned down that amount of volatile compounds so that it doesn't disrupt their gut flora the same way. They become less toxic to the deer and they eat them readily. And in fact, they're super high in nitrogen, which we'll talk about a little later. They're super high in nitrogen, and it's like the best granola bar they could possibly find on the ground, just sticking out right above the snow, super accessible for them to eat. So when you think about wintering mule deer and habitat and sagebrush, these leaders, the flower stalks that come off the top, are really an important kind of keystone part of that whole amazing set of events. And it's not all altruism from the sagebrush. Some of those little bitty seeds do pass all the way through the critter and help disperse the seeds out on the landscape in the deer pellets after passing through their digestive tract. So kind of the sagebrush is sending up that flower stalk, and it's hey, this is super high nitrogen, it's sticking above the snow, you can eat it all you want, and it's going to spread seed a little bit further. So a kind of a cool set of kind of unspoken agreements, you might say, between these species. One more that's important in the winter that I'll mention is the greater sage grouse, which we have in Washington. It's endangered in the state of Washington. It's not doing great at the countrywide scale either. A really amazing critter I could spend a whole hour talking about just themselves. Part of why this bird looks so big is that its gut system, its digestive tract, is one of the only animals in the world, if not the only. It survives almost on 100% sagebrush leaves through the winter season. So all their other plants they like to eat, all the insects and stuff, are all covered in snow. And so the only thing that they can get access to is a sagebrush. So that is a super challenging set of plant material to digest, just like they're not ruminants, right? They don't have that advantage of having like a system of microbes that can digest all that material, and they have to be able to fly. And so there's this really fascinating kind of intersection of what's the heaviest gut I can have and still be able to fly. You get the sage grouse, and I'll talk a little bit more about them. But yeah, Frank.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
What form is the nitrogen in the plants? Is it amino compounds, is it proteins, or what?
Mostly amino compounds.
Also fairly soluble then.
Yes, and some are locked up in proteins but aren't necessarily super accessible either.
Okay.
Nitrogen is a real limiting nutrient. That's why you put it on your garden. You know, like sometimes that's the one thing kind of holding something back from being more successful. And what Frank's question was about is like, if these critters are eating sagebrush, how accessible is that super limiting nutrient? And it depends on the time of year and then what part of the plant they're eating. So on the sagebrush in the wintertime, they've seen it all before. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the plant in the winter. As a part of certain research projects I've done, I've actually counted growth rings of big sagebrush like a tree. And so that's what you're seeing there. And I'll kind of comment too, just briefly on like, this is also what a cross section of a sagebrush can look like. And we'll talk about it when we get to the summer season. But they're anything but regular, right? Kind of a remarkable ability to sort of, it's called programmed cell death. They can let part of themselves die. Like if my right arm was not serving me any well, if I was a sagebrush, I could just continue on with my life and just be like, well, I used to have that arm, but it just wasn't doing me any favors. And so I had to move on. And that's what you're seeing here, is that the plant was like, okay, there used to be maybe some growth here. And it's like, that's why if you walk up Jacobson or other places where there's some really old sagebrush, they're so gnarly and twisted and had moved around. But that's all to say that winter is one of those seasons that can also be super taxing. And just something that always blows my socks off is the way all plants, not just sagebrush, all woody plants survive the winter. You've got a plant, it's got roots. Sagebrush roots are super deep, sometimes multiple meters. And the way they get water from the bottom to the top is through, forgive my terrible clip art, but a series of straws. It's called xylem, if you want a fancy botanical word. Another way to think about it is wood. Anything that is wood is made from xylem. It's just a series of these straws. And the thing about the straws is, once you fill it with water, the column of water can never, ever break. Never, ever break, unless the plant will die. That's what happens when plants die of drought, is they break their xylem. You can actually hook a microphone up to a plant that is dying from a drought, and you can hear the xylem breaking. And so, okay, sure, sounds really complicated, but I'll buy it. What if it was your job to hold a straw full of water out in the Wenatchee foothills in January and to not let the water in that straw freeze? It's through a really remarkable set of architecture and like pumping salts around and kind of turning the water in the straws into antifreeze that the sagebrush is able to survive the winter. But the next time you're hiking up Jacobson or wherever, and it's frozen as outside, and you're like, good job, like not freezing solid, because that plant is still full of water and is going to be ready to continue on growing as soon as it's warm enough. We'll talk more about the straws later in the talk, but just to kind of remind yourself, that's what you're looking down into when you look at the cross sections. You're looking down into those vessels, into the ways that the straws are all connected and packed together. And I just threw this photo in to sort of demonstrate how that growth can sort of change over time. Sagebrush are not Douglas firs. They do not grow straight and tall. They're shrubs. And because of drought effects and other things, that's how they get all that twisted growth. Springtime, the break of winter, we've made it. The flowers are blooming, things are thawing, biological activity is increasing. We're going to talk a bit about like the flower part in a little bit, but I just want to kind of Remind you what's over the river in Douglas County going on in the springtime, the dance of the sage grouse. So if you're not familiar with this amazing critter, it every year returns to the same site with remarkable loyalty and does a really amazing set of dances to attract mates. The males do anyway. If you've never played a video of this, I'll spare you today, but play a video. They have these air sets on their chests. They inflate and deflate and brush their wings against each other, and it's like they're straight off another planet. It's really otherworldly, but just one of those springtime things that are going on in the sagebrush steppe. And very much so, we used to have sagebrush exactly. I mean, we used to have sage grouse exactly where Wenatchee is before we built a town here. So we're very much in the range of where they used to be, and they just don't like people as much, and so now they're just more out in Douglas County. So other critters going on. This photo is from our own Susan Ballinger. It's just some gee whiz stuff about big sagebrush. There's over 30 species of midges, which are a kind of insect that will lay their eggs in a sagebrush stem, and the chemical suite and the interaction that goes on there is the insect larva convince the plant to grow a whole protective case around their larva, and so that the larva has the right kind of microenvironment to develop in, and then emerges as an adult. Those are called galls, G-A-L-L, galls. And what's really remarkable about Susan's photo is that there are two species of gall on the same plant, just inches from each other. If you're a gall enthusiast, or you think you might be one, have a look at sagebrush, because there's really a remarkable number of species that
Another
are on it.
question.
Yeah,
Is that one insect or more?
it's usually just one, but I think it can be more. And there's some that are like spongy, there's some that are like droopy and gross, but most of them are kind of just like nondescript and small and kind of round. But if you ever see like some weird ball on a plant, it's probably a midge. Also, on insects that like are totally devoted to big sagebrush, there's over 40 species of aphid that will feed on sagebrush alone. So also another thing to kind of zoom in with your hand lens in the springtime is just to sort of keep an eye out for these little critters. So I want to kind of start talking about why sagebrush is so good at growing where it grows. This is a photo of Castle Rock Ridge, and just like, I'm a little out of sequence, but one side is way greener than the other. And so in our particular zone, right on the western edge of big sagebrush, almost on the northern edge, we are so governed by the power of the sun and drying things out. Like that's what marks the end of springtime, right? Is this powerful ball in the sky that is just beaming down and starting to heat things up. But you can see this is still spring. We have more green on the north side and more dry on the south side. How is this happening? Well, let's take a look below ground. So this is what sagebrush looks like below ground. You've got some familiar players there, your lupins and other phloxes and other things, lots and lots of roots going on, right? Here's is in the real world. This is out at Spiva Butte, which is a land trust conserved property out in Douglas County. Remarkable diversity, can be super thick. There's a party going on. I mean, this is also Spiva Butte, thick with grasses and sagebrush growing together. Locally, if you ask a rancher, they might say, we gotta burn it, we gotta chain it, we gotta mow it, we need to get this sagebrush out of there. It's taking space from our grasses, right? Some of y'all might have heard that before. Well, I want to unpack that a little bit. If you take here's our sagebrush plant. If you take what is called in the sciences a monolith of soil, forgive my clip art, but let's take a 1 meter box, so about half the size of this table, 30 centimeters thick. What's that? 30 centimeters thick. So a box, if it was a box of donuts, you'd be like, those are big donuts, but I'm interested. If you took a box of donuts from under the sagebrush, how long, if you stretched them all out, how many roots do you think are in that box? Just have a number in your mind. The total length of roots in that 1 meter by 1 meter box is over 5 kilometers. So you can pound out a 5K. Here's my art. This is why I tribute artists, because this is what art would look like if I was in charge of it. 5 kilometers of roots just in that one little block of soil. It's pretty busy stuff. A lot of those are fine roots, kind of like on the macro or microscopic scale, but that is all to say, there's a lot of action going on, and there's consequences to it. A root is a specialized plant structure that, what's it do, right? It holds a plant to the ground and it sucks water up, right? And we've already talked about straws and all that stuff. Roots are important. Roots, because they need the ability to suck up water, sort of have this double-edged sword, is that they're also kind of leaky and they also lose water. You can't have a porous plant part that is really good at sucking up water without it also losing a little bit of water. So there's like a whole enormous set of consequences biologically for having a leaky root system. So if you pick up soil in your hands, thanks for everybody that's been out planting. I see you out there. The soil in your hand by volume and weight, or however you want to parse it, is about half mineral, and then the other half is air and water. You even dry soil in your hand, you might be like, not very wet. I can't make a mud ball out of it. Sure, water comes and goes, but even some of that water is super tightly held. So what a sagebrush is like absolutely remarkable at is sort of finding a way to get at that last 25% of water, especially when water's super dry. So it's really good at it, and it's going really deep. What a sagebrush does every night when the sun goes down is, after the leaves stop photosynthesizing, there's so much inertia from it pulling water up from the lower layers that it starts to leak water out of its root structure. So those 5 kilometers of roots that are right in that 1 centimeter square all start leaking water. Well, who benefits from that? All the plants and microbes and insects and everything else that grows in the area. And so you can tell your rancher friend that, oh, sure, sagebrush might take up a little bit of space, but this hydraulic lift, the word that we use in research, takes water from those deep soil layers and literally pumps it uphill, up in the soil profile, up to shallow surface layers. So that's why the Land Trust cares so much about keeping sagebrush on the landscape. It is not just the plant itself, but it's this amazing foundational critter, plant that can like actually totally change the qualities of the site. If you stand in a place that's burned a bunch of times, and it's just a bunch of dry cheatgrass on the ground or whatever, it feels hot and dry, right? If you stand on the same site that hasn't burned, or a similar site that hasn't burned, and there's sagebrush there, the ground might be a little softer. The grasses might be a little bit taller, much less all the hiding cover and forage and all the good stuff for wildlife. The presence of these shrubs can fundamentally change the rate of biological activity on the site and can make for a much more diverse plant community, which is a more diverse ecosystem. So this doesn't happen by accident. The world's full of trade-offs. Like there is a cost to having these shrubs out there, but broadly, the sagebrush are like really engineering and changing the quality of the site. So if you talk to managers like the Land Trust or the state or federal agencies that manage land, that's why we care so much about keeping sagebrush on the ground. And we're going to talk about that right at the end of the talk. But I wanted to pivot before we leave before we leave spring and kind of get into summer, of this whole system. So there you are, you're in the sagebrush step. And you want to think about herbivory, right? Animals eating plants. It happens all the time. If you have a cat and house plants, it's even happening at that scale. But generally, like you think about this, you're like, oh, sure, there's some deer out there. There's some squirrels, some ground squirrels. Like that's most of the herbivory, right? Well, a couple of things, some gee whiz numbers is if you were able to sort of just vacuum up all the living matter, 2 things. Most of the living matter in the system is below ground. And part and parcel with that, most of the herbivory in the system is also below ground. So despite all the mouthfuls that every deer and every ground squirrel take, most of the herbivory, sorry for the squeamish, is from nematodes. Most pound by pound, pound for pound, most of it comes from these little worms that live in the soil surface and are just eating away at these leaky soil roots, roots in the soil that we talked about. So that blew my mind when I learned it, just because I grew up on a farm with cows, and I'm just used to like, oh yeah, cows take big bites, that's where most of the biomass goes. But no, in sagebrush, nematodes really running the show. And there's a whole lot of sagebrush ecology, plant defenses, so many things that we don't understand yet because these are kind of hard to study. Summertime. So we just survived a summer smoke season. Things start to dry out. So let's talk a bit about how sagebrush are able to survive these super dry, hot summers. First of all, the leaves are incredibly specialized. They're very hairy. I think that's my next slide. They're very hairy. They're covered with these hairs. What do the hairs do? Well, in addition to have those anti-herbivore compounds, they actually reflect light and they make it cooler. It's like a tiny little shade shelter. Our land manager over there has a sun hoodie on. You know, those, they're like a, can you put your hood up for the people there? So like a sagebrush leaf is just the same as kind of putting that sun hood on, even though it's like right next to your skin. Just that little bit of a barrier helps decrease temperatures and keep it lower. And then for the super botanical nerds out there, there's this big break in the plant community or the plant kingdom on C3 versus C4 photosynthesis. It's basically, are you how do you photosynthesize and how efficient are you? Some really famous C4 plants are corn. And there's a lot of consequences to like how C3 and C4 play out. And I'll stop my botanical nerding out here. Sagebrush has like almost a C4 architecture to the inside of its leaf, which basically means it is like super duper water efficient, even though it doesn't actually have this photosynthetic pathway. It's like mimicked it almost in a convergent evolutionary kind of perspective. Another way that sagebrush is super duper equipped to survive the summer is like, you may not know this, but every year it puts on these really long leaves that they seem kind of too long for a sagebrush. They are deciduous, they're semi-deciduous plants. And so depending on how many resources are available, if it's like kind of a dry year, kind of a wet year, they will put on more or less of these. And then as soon as it's too hot, they're like, I'm done, dropping them just like a maple tree on a park, on a street or in a park. They will drop their leaves in a semi-deciduous way. And then just a cross section of the leaf. What's kind of interesting is like these little bits that you see are actually the hairs that were caught in the cross section. Just a really fun gee whiz thing from some research I've done. It's almost Halloween, and if you need a party trick, there's big sagebrush is kind of split into these different subspecies, and the mountain big sagebrush, if you crush up its leaves and put it in a little bit of water, it will actually glow that blue under a black light. So if you needed a little bit of a party trick at your Halloween party, go find some mountain big sagebrush leaves, and it will actually show you that this photo is demonstrating is like a gradient of hybridization between Wyoming big sagebrush and mountain big sagebrush. Okay, just a little side quest there. How else do sagebrush stand the heat? Well, the next time you're out hiking, I encourage you to look directly down at a sagebrush plant. And what is really remarkable is how slender they are in profile to the sun to help reduce heat load. So you look at a sagebrush plant and you're like, it's got all kinds of leaf surface area. Look at all that. All those leaves are pointing almost directly up. And so when you look at it in profile, it's like kind of remarkable how much it's like hiding from the sun and self-shading as a way to kind of mitigate how hot it can get and reduce water loss. So our sagebrush flowers are out in the late summer, right? Kurt brought some in, thank you, Kurt. They're out there. The next time you're outside, you can still find them. They're kind of maturing into fruits, which is our tiny seeds. And to Frank's question earlier, these seeds are almost 20% protein by volume. And I looked it up, and that's like on the scale of a hamburger in protein content. So, there's lots of reasons why critters might want to eat these seeds. And the last reason why, or the latest reason why sagebrush bloom in the fall is to reduce the chances of herbivory. So these are, I mean, there's a little bit of advantage to having critters eat your seeds and disperse them, like I talked about with the winter. But if they hang on too long, then it's like a risk factor. And so having the seeds on the plant for a very small amount of time means that they're much more likely to get on the ground and germinate. We're back to fall. I just took this photo the other day, checking up on Ryan's work on Saddle Rock. And, you know, the land just welcomes those first rains, right? I mean, I know that we were all there just for fire risk and other things. We were so happy to feel those first rains on the ground, and then we got more rain in the forecast. And the sagebrush, we're counting on it all along. This is on one of our conservation easements, just north of us. And I took this picture because of a sagebrush plant that was quite enthusiastically reproducing there. And as I talked about with like why managers care, this is LiDAR, which is a laser beam that was shot from space and reflected back up to a satellite, and it gives us this incredible surface topography of Saddle Rock. You can see the switchbacks up there, a little bit of it. Let's take a zoom in. We can see exactly where the sagebrush are and exactly where the sagebrush are not. And so, as managers, we do a lot of thinking about the highest and best use, and then also that ecologically. It's okay to have a burn, it's okay to lose your sagebrush, but if they're not coming back, you know, sometimes we'll nudge a system and we'll sort of lovingly direct it so that we get those amazing plants back there and can kind of make those connections happen so that all the other benefits that we've talked about can be enjoyed. And the integrity of the system is almost always stronger with the more diverse assemblage of species. So look into the future. What's it going to look like? You know, we have such an incredible history of human disturbance. We were running sheep through here by the zillions a while ago. We calmed that down, but we're still suffering the consequences. Fire is ever present. Sagebrush are flammable. They don't like to resprout after fire, and so that kind of leaves us with our own set of management challenges. And the climate. This is a photo from a heat dome. You know, like there's some real bottlenecks out there from a management perspective that we have to keep in account as stewards of the land. So kind of this crazy three-legged stool that we have to sit on, trying to preserve biological integrity. So it's a challenge that can be joyful if you slow down and look at it. So I would encourage you to, in fact, do hug a sagebrush. It might be a little prickly, but there's so many things that you can see if you slow down and look, and especially watch it through the year, right? You know, any given day of the calendar year, you're like, there's something going on, even in those long summer days or long winter nights. There's biological activity keeps going.
The flowers aren't prickly.
The flowers are not prickly, so
It's a good time of year to be hugging them.
give them a bet. Thanks so much for your attention, folks. I love this stuff and we'll be happy to take it. Yes, sir.
So I have a sagebrush plant at home that I brought in a little flower of it, and it blooms beautifully every year. I live in East Wenatchee, but it's lonely and it is not reproducing on its own. So what would be the advice you would give me? You know, when did the seeds disperse? Would I cut some more of the flower? There's tons of flowers on there right now. You know, we've had our first rains. If I've got an area where I would like for it to grow, would I just cut some and spread it around? Do I need to start it in a greenhouse? What's your advice?
It's a great question. They're notorious, and for the folks online, Kurt's question was about, you know, how can I get more sagebrush to grow around my house where I already have one, but not more? The Land Trust has a really great history. Susan Ballinger, who many of you know, sort of like single-handedly harvesting mature seed heads, taking them into the Land Trust basement, making the whole place smell like sagebrush, and drying them out a little bit. And so I think that's kind of your grassroots mode.
Bring them inside and dry it out a bit.
Harvest some of those, find a good vent in your house that's got some drying force to it, and then put those dried seeds out. There's so many cues that seeds need to be able to germinate. Sagebrush seeds, as 1 millimeter long, like notoriously have low rates of viability, and so you might kind of play around with that.
Okay.
Kind of along those lines, how are the restorations efforts going with sagebrush in the land trust line?
On land trust properties, really well. We have a few areas like a Horse Lake and historic farmyards where there was a lot of compaction, a lot of litter, just like stuff around the barn, like it's just a busy area that we have planted sagebrush seedlings directly into, and they're doing quite well. That's at small scales in the foothills, and we've got some lines in the water for some creative ways to get sagebrush back onto hotter, drier aspects as well. A little bit of supplemental water and shading. And then out on our large scale conservation properties, there's some very remarkable conservation success stories from Susan Ballinger, sort of like doing 100 things at once and spreading those pre-dried sagebrush seeds out and flinging the seeds out into plots as well as planting out there. So we had a property burn in the 2020 Pearl Hill fire, burned wall to wall down to the ground. And you almost wouldn't know it now with how successfully it's coming back. Yes, ma'am.
Is that true with Spiva Butte? Because that is really,
Yeah, that's where I was referencing. It's
Yeah.
Spiva Butte. It's really remarkable in how resilient is recovering after fire. Yes, sir.
Could you talk a little bit more about the xylem stuff? Is that the water rising, or is the stuff that makes the water rise, or what is that?
There's a reason why water is a fundamental building block of life. And like the dipole of one oxygen and two hydrogens is like the polarity and the surface tension of water is what makes that happen. And so you can think about it like a chain. And so water always is polar. And so the positively charged ends wants to connect to the negatively charged ends, like hands across the foothills. And so you can just like pull on a chain, like if you fill your cup up too tall and you get like that little bit of a bubble, or if you're playing with water on a surface like your car windshield, you can kind of like run your finger and like water comes with it. That is the surface tension of water and that polarity.
Okay, but the xylem, is that the process, or is that
Xylem is
substance, or what is it?
xylem is a name for a kind of plant cell. And so there's like these straws,
Oh,
and there's a whole fascinating realm of like the architecture of the inside of the straw is anything but smooth. It's often pitted. You have like these little cups in the inside of the cell wall that helps water adhere to it and keep the surface tension together. So your tomato plant, if you forget to water it, it's a drama queen. It's like happy one day and the next day it's just like absolutely lost. Have you ever seen a sagebrush do that? No, it's because it's xerified. It loves dry places. And so sagebrush xylem architecture is like super finely tuned for dry conditions. And just another fascinating thing, all wood, all xylem, everything, they're dead cells. They're not alive anymore. And so the plant has to like grow them and then let them die. And they leave them filled with water. And that's how xylem works. Plants, who knew? I mean, I'm telling you, the more you look, the more there is to be excited about. Yes, ma'am. For someone.
Question on Zoom from Stuart Smith. What is Tridentata's strategy for not resprouting after fire?
That's a great question that I've sadly, Mr. Smith, I don't have a great answer to. I would just comment this, that sagebrush are so good at so many things, you can't be good at everything. And there's a metabolic cost to being able to resprout after fire, which is essentially like, should I talk about meristems? So if you walk up to a tree and you tack a little sign in the tree, right? This is a tree. It's tulip poplar or whatever. If you come back in 5 years, will the sign have grown up? No. The sign stays right there, right? And so just the nature of how plants grow, they're more like bricks. We are animals, we don't have cell walls. That's because we need to be able to move around. Plants have cell walls, which is like a really stiff thing. So every plant cell that gets put in, sort of like cemented in place. That's why your sign doesn't go up or down. the long story short is that in order to be able to survive from a fire, the sagebrush would have to invest in some of those special cells right at the surface of the soil, and then they would have to not get too hot, and then it would be able to resprout. Some species can, and sagebrush is one that can. Yes, sir.
My impression is that we have about 4 species of Artemisia here. Am I correct?
I thank you for reminding me for a gee whiz number that I didn't put out there. So our humble local sagebrush, Artemisia tridentata, genus is Artemisia. Any guesses on how many species are in that genus? It's more than 4. 400! And so we have about 4 in the area. There's more in North America. There's maybe 30 or 60 in North America. If you dug up every sagebrush in North America and put it in a pile, and then you dug up every Artemisia in the Asian continent and put it in a pile, they have way more.
Pteridin is Artemisia.
Right. And there's like anti-malaria drugs that have come out of Artemisia, a lot of traditional medicines and things like that. So it's a globally distributed group of plants.
You can't just walk around and say, that's big sagebrush. You gotta look at it and figure out what it is.
That's a different talk. One more question?
What's the plant benefit by exuding that smell that, what does it gain? Given the investment?
It's mostly anti-herbivory and in the critical time of year. So I could have presented that better. But in the springtime, it ramps up production. And it's like, this is the wet time of year. It's time to go. I need to get all my annual growth in before it dries out too much in the soil. And so they double down and they make their leaves more toxic to eat. And so investing so heavily in those volatile compounds is a way to protect their investment because they don't grow very fast and they don't resprout after fire. Lots of things are hungry that time of year. There's pretty good protein in them, and so they protect their investment. So go crush a couple sagebrush leaves and have a smell, and smell them at different times of year. They do change over the course of the year. But thanks for your questions, everyone.
Thanks so much, Sam. There were a lot of gee whiz things that I learned today.
Yeah.
That was fantastic. Just to let you know, we are going to take a bit of a pause on Lunch and Learns for November and December. The holidays just kind of interrupt the flow. So we'll let you know what we have planned for January, probably at the end of December. But please hang around if you can, have some more snacks, talk to staff. It's really fun to have you all in our building today. So thank you.
Thank you.
Right.